Okay, welcome everybody to this evening's presentation. Tonight we're going to be talking about the fantastic life of bats, and our presenter tonight is Levi Johnson. He is a wildlife technician with the Southeast region of the Pennsylvania Game Commission. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Levi.
Thanks everybody for coming and listening in. Hopefully everyone gets to leave with a hopefully everybody gets to leave with some good information about bats, and hopefully I can teach you something tonight. So as Phoebe introduced, my name is Levi Johnson. I'm the wildlife disease technician for the Southeastern region with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Just a little bit of background about me. I got my master's studying bats down in Ohio. I did a lot of hibernation work down there. And then 2022, I got a job with the Game Commission doing bat and both deer work, but my passion is always laid on the bat side of things. I might be bat biased, if you will. And so with that, we're going to start here talking about the fantastic life of bats. So just to start off, bats belong to the order Chiroptera. In Latin, this means hand wing, right? Their wings are part of their hands, and we'll learn that in just a second. But this is an extremely diverse order of mammals, second to rodentia for the highest species count. So really in all of the world, there are X amount of rodents, and that makes up the largest mammalian group. Next up would be bats. We just have the 1,500 species, so 1,500 species. It was the Bioko Island pipistrelle. That's Pipistrellus etula, for those of you in tune with your Latin. It was discovered in June of 2025 on an island in Equatorial Guinea off the coast of Africa. So that would be the 1,500th bat species currently known. I'm sure there are more. And among all of these 1,500 species, the diets can vary drastically, and the size and the shape, which you will see, can also vary drastically. So bat diets can mean anything from insects. We have insectivorous bats, fruits, nectar, fish, other mammals, including other bats, and sometimes even blood for your sanguivorous vampire bats. One really cool fact is that the bats are the only mammals capable of true flight. A lot of people tend to equate them to mice or mainly mice and rodents. This is not the case. But the other mammal that comes up as being flighted is the northern flying squirrel or a flying squirrel. Not the case. Those are actually gliding squirrels. They are not capable of true flight, unlike bats, which can fly indefinitely. Something else that separates them from mere rodents, right, is that bats are incredibly long-lived. And so in captivity, it has been noted that bats can live sometimes up to 30 years. So I'm 28 years old. There might be bats flying around in the state here that are older than I am, which is a really cool thought to have. Moving on here, we'll talk a little bit about anatomy. So when you see a bat, they don't look like us. They don't look like mice, maybe except for they're small and have brown fur, right? But bats are made up mainly of a body and a wing and a head, right? So starting off here, and I can put my video back on just so I can point, you guys can look. Bats, their wings are their biggest distinguishing feature, right? Wings and ears. And so when we talk about bat wings, all of the bones of the hand and the arm serve for support for that wing membrane, right? And so they have a shortened humerus, that's your upper arm where your bicep is. And then they have the elbow, which you can see here. If you can see my mouse, not sure. And then they have an elongated forearm, right? And that leads to the wrist. The thumb is the only free digit that bats have, and they use it to cling on to things. So that's what you see right off the wrist there. And then each finger or digit, phalange, is elongated as well, and that again helps to form the support for that wing membrane. The wing membrane itself has a few different names depending on which bone it spans between. So in between the fingers, we'll call that the dactylopatagium. Between the pinky finger and what is the leg, we call the pelagiopatagium. And the important thing here to remember for later on is that we're going to be looking at the uropatagium. That's the tail membrane. And so essentially that is the piece of wing that forms between the legs, and then the tail is kind of in the center there. And that becomes pretty important when we start talking about feeding strategies. The other thing that bats are known for is the large ears that they sometimes have. And bat ears play a very specific role in echolocation, which we'll talk about in a few slides here. But when we look at the ear specifically, we want to target the penna, or the pinna, which is the main part of the ear there. And then right at the bottom is something called the tragus. So the tragus in humans, sometimes people get it pierced, is this little bump that you have on the inside of your ear, right? And on bats, that's usually like a butter knife shape or a dagger shaped piece of skin, and that has a really important role in echolocation. And so sometimes we use the tragus of bats to identify and tell apart different species. So I'll turn my video back off, and we'll move on here to bat evolutions and origins. And so really an animal like a bat, we would think they look really weird. They don't look like a lot of other mammals, and they can fly. Certainly something must have happened for them to get this way, right? It turns out biologists don't know. There is no missing link fossil that exists to explain the true evolution from non-volant, which means non-flying, mammals to bats. The closest thing that biologists have to work with is that one species here, it's called O. finii, which is this thing on the right here, this animal, was thought to be the most primitive known bat. It probably could fly or glide. We see those big, long, extended phalanges that probably held a wing membrane, extended forearms, right? But judging by the ear bones and the shape of the head, they probably couldn't echolocate. And so this is kind of what we would think that bats came from, something very similar to a flying squirrel, right? Over millions and millions of years, we get something highly specified to fly around at night, use echolocation, which is the modern bat. Here we have an example of a pallid bat, which is native to the Western Americas. So moving on, a really cool thing about bats is the ability for them to echolocate. We all kind of understand how echolocation works, right? So a bat emits a sound pulse from its mouth. That sound travels a distance, bounces off of an object, whether it be a tree that the bat is trying to avoid or a bug that the bat wants to eat, bounces back to the bat. And inside of their head, they are able to convert that sound into a sort of picture of what is around them while they're flying. Something important, though, is not all bats echolocate. Bats don't need to echolocate if they're not, one, flying in the nighttime, similar to this flying fox here, which might just be flying in more dusky conditions. They are active in the daytime as well. And then fruit and nectar bats also tend not to echolocate very strongly. This is because their food is not flying away from them. They're brightly colored fruits or flowers, so they're pretty easy to pick out. And as long as you have those big eyes, like a cat or something, it serves them well enough to be able to fly around, not bump into things and find their food. But when we talk about bats that echolocate, we have different types of echolocation. So we have a true echolocation, like what the Sardinian long-eared bat uses. We have a tongue click echolocation, which is where instead of emitting that pulse with the vocal cords, they're just clicking their tongue. Very basic, kind of primitive form of echolocation. Some fruit bats will use this, like your Egyptian fruit bats here. And then Doppler shift compensation is where we get into these big leaf nose bats that live in jungles, very tight areas that they need to fly around and have the most resolution of their habitat while they're flying around at night. And so you start seeing all of these very weird nose shapes to either force a sound to get out into the landscape, or maybe to even receive. It kind of acts like a satellite dish, right? Like this trefoil horseshoe bat, South America. Cool thing about bats is that a larger tragus usually indicates a higher frequency of echolocation. When we look at the tragus, like on this northern long-eared bat here, this is a native PA species. We see that dagger-like tragus. And what this means to us is the longer and kind of more skinny that tragus is, it might indicate a higher frequency of echolocation. Those of you who remember physics class, higher frequencies tend to travel a little bit faster, but not as far. And so when you're in a really tightly cluttered area, these bats are pulsing sometimes up to 200 times per second. They are emitting noises. I can't even talk that fast, and I know I'm talking pretty quickly right now. But essentially, when you have that higher frequency, travels faster, bounces off of objects more quickly, and so they get a better idea of their landscape. Versus a bat with a smaller tragus or maybe a not as developed tragus like your big browns or your eastern red bats that tend to fly in more open areas. And so they'll use a lower frequency of echolocation because that sound, again from physics, lower frequencies will travel farther distances, but move a little bit slower, right? And so when you're in a big open field like that, they might not be as concerned with immediately having to turn or make any quick maneuvers. They might be trying to forage for a bug that might be 60 yards away instead of this northern long-eared that usually flies in places that you would not like to hike through, just very dense vegetation. And then finally, larger ears typically indicate a more passive listening bat. So we have this lesser false vampire bat here on your right-hand screen. But even with this northern long-eared in this last picture here, those long ears, just like any animal that has large ears, right? They can hear better. That it captures more sound with those larger ears, and so they can passively listen for bugs chittering or maybe a cricket chirping on a leaf, and they can hone in on that more easily. So we get into the feeding strategies of insectivorous bats. This is what they're using their echolocation for. And so there are two specific types of feeding strategies. One is gleaning, which is using sight, insect noise, and echolocation to snag prey off of the ground or foliage. When we talked about that northern long-eared bat, they are a gleaning bat. And so with those big ears, they're flying very slowly through the woods and listening for insects making sounds, whether they're perched on a leaf or a branch. They will hone in on that and use a little bit of echolocation to determine where on a branch or a stick they might be, and they snag them off of the leaf. This is different from hawking, which is using insect noise and echolocation to catch prey in flight, usually via scooping with the tail membrane. So remember when I talked to you a few slides ago about that uropatagium, that tail membrane, you could see it there between the legs of this long-eared myotis, another western species, sorry. But what they do essentially is you don't want to echolocate, and then the minute you are going to grab that bug, stop echolocating because you then have to use your mouth to grab the bug. So what they are doing is they actually use their tail membrane as kind of a scoop. It's almost like a net motion, and they will do a tuck mid-air and grab that insect off of their tail membrane and then eat it. So it enables them to fly, use echolocation the whole time, right up into the point where they catch that bug or insect or prey, and then scoop it up with the tail membrane. So that leads us into the bat life cycle. So most bats reproduce in the late summer and early fall, right about now, actually. This is called swarming season. And so this is kind of a dual purpose season for bats. Not only are they trying to reproduce, but they often start heading towards where they hibernate to check out their hibernation spot, make sure it's still there. If it's a mine, maybe it had collapsed over the summer and they need a little bit to find a new spot, right? So they usually start heading there early. And then the swarming season, it's not uncommon to see bats just circling outside of these hibernacula for the evening. Bats then will enter hibernation for the winter time, November through March. This is pretty the quiet season for bats. They are torpid, they're hibernating, waiting for the summertime to come in the spring when the bugs come back out and they have something to eat again, right? And then fertilization occurs in the spring after hibernation, which should be a head scratcher because I said that they reproduce in the late summer in the early fall. And as it turns out, bats, like some hibernating mammals, I think foxes do this as well. Bats are actually a mammal that practices, it's called delayed fertilization and implantation. And so essentially what happens is these bats reproduce and the female will store that sperm, those gametes inside of her body but they are cut off from fertilizing the egg. So she's not pregnant, but that the gametes are inside of her already. And so as soon as spring comes and she wakes up from hibernation, she then gets pregnant and then flies off to the maternity colonies, where you see big clusters of bats in barns or attics. Those are most likely maternity colonies. All the females will kind of cluster together, raise their pups together throughout the summer. The males are usually off doing their own thing. They're pretty absent fathers, but that's kind of what you see when you see a lot of bats in one big structure throughout the summertime as a maternity colony. So they're in there having pups, right? Most bats give birth to a single pup. There are some outlier species. We have red bats in the state that can have twins, but most bats only give birth to a single pup. These bats are really tiny and they need to fly around, and so more than one baby makes it kind of hard to do that while they're pregnant. And that's what the pups look like. On the right is a big brown pup. Usually pups will grow up incredibly fast, so they're born in mid-June. By the end of July, they're virtually indistinguishable from adult bats in both size and fur, shape, everything. And so if you catch a bat that is 20 years old and a bat that is 3 months old, you would be hard-pressed to be able to tell them apart. The only way we know is obviously by banding and recapture studies, or if you catch them by the first year, similar to babies, human babies, some of their bones haven't quite ossified all the way, and so they still have a little bit of translucence to the bones in the wing. So with that, now that we know a little bit about bats and how they echolocate, how they feed, I've shown you some pictures of bats that aren't from Pennsylvania. Let's talk about the bats that are from Pennsylvania. So every bat in Pennsylvania, which we have 9, there is a 10 and 11th bat that is making its way up from the southern states, but we'll leave those out for today. But they all belong to the family Vespertilionidae, which means simple-nosed bats. Across the world, there are 400 species of Vespertilionidae, but we have 9 of them. Of those 400, Myotis is the most common species. There's over 100 worldwide. Pennsylvania has 4 of them. And so we'll investigate those in just a second. But Vesper bats are often characterized by having plain-looking faces with small eyes and moderate to enormous ears. So what we see here on this cluster of little brown bats is they do have kind of a more simple nose. As we get into more pictures, you'll be able to see kind of like a dog muzzle, right? We don't have those big leaf-shaped noses and big wonky ears, right? And with these Vesper bats, they also have a broad wing and a complete uropatagium, which would make sense because, like I said, with that uropatagium, that tail membrane, the bats are all insectivorous in Pennsylvania. They eat insects, and so they need that complete tail membrane to catch insects, right? So starting off here with the smaller species of bats in Pennsylvania, I'll just kind of walk you through them, show you a couple pictures here. Starting off, we have the tricolored bat. The tricolored bat is Perimyotis subflavus. I'll give you the Latin names too. Very small, kind of blondie colored bat. Cool fact about them is that they are not named because they're 3 different colors, but rather each individual hair is 3 different colors, which is where the tricolored name comes from. So if you were to pull off a hair and stick it under a microscope, you would see that it starts black and then gets brown and then gets kind of white at the tips, or some combination of those 3. And so that's how it got the name tricolored bat. Next up, we have the eastern small-footed bat. You'll learn that these are very conveniently named. Eastern small-footed bats have smaller feet than the other bats. Believe it or not, we're looking at like 4 or 5 millimeters from the tip of the toe to the ankle, right? So really, really tiny. Eastern small-footed bats weigh around 5 grams. The smallest species, sometimes they kind of take the title back and forth between tricolors and eastern small-footeds, depending on the time of year, but you're looking at 4 to 5 grams. Just to put that into perspective on how much these bats weigh, one, that is my adult thumb. I'm about 6'1" feet tall. I do have kind of larger hands, but that's my thumb holding that small-footed bat. But 4 to 5 grams is about 5 grams is the weight of a nickel. 1 US nickel. And if you have some dollar bills nearby, $1 bill weighs 1 gram. So if you have $4 bills, you would be holding the equivalent weight of an eastern small-footed bat. They're incredibly tiny. Next up, we have the little brown bat, which some of you might know about. So little browns are a pretty common bat, common smaller bodied bat here in Pennsylvania. They're one of the ones really affected by white nose syndrome. A little bit larger than these other two. You're kind of looking at anywhere between 6 and 10 grams most of the time. Next up, we have the northern long-eared bat. Again, one of those really creative names where it has longer ears than these other bats you see here on the screen, right? Usually anywhere from 15 to 16 millimeters long from the bottom of the tragus there to the tip of the ear. Northern long-eared bats are kind of rare in Pennsylvania. We see them a lot in very cluttered habitat, very wooded habitat. And it's one of the species, again, affected by white nose syndrome. And then finally, we have the Indiana bat, virtually indistinguishable from a little brown bat. When we talk about characteristic features, there are a few ways to tell, but we can leave it at that. Again, another species, you might recognize the Indiana bat because they are federally listed. Northern long-eared bats have also just been federally listed or federally endangered. Word on the street is that the little brown and the tricolored bat might also be joining them soon, but that has not been officiated yet. So moving on, we'll talk about the larger bodied bats here in Pennsylvania, starting off with the big brown bat, one of my personal favorites, incredibly hardy bat, very common, probably one of the most common bats you will find. If you have a bat in your home, I can usually bet my lunch money that it is a big brown bat. Aptesicus fuscus is the Latin name there. Sorry, I forgot to mention the others. If you're wondering, I can list them off for you after. But the big brown bat, like I said, very common, very hardy. When I was doing hibernation work down in Ohio, we would regularly find these guys hibernating below freezing. So spots where, you know, they might be at 29 degrees. Somehow they manage not to freeze, and they are very, very tough bats, which is why we tend to find them kind of everywhere. They've seemed to weather white nose syndrome pretty well. Next up, we have the silver-haired bat. Silver-haired bats look like older big browns, essentially, about the same size, but they have gray and black, kind of silvery tipped white fur. Next up, we have the hoary bat, Lasiaris cineris. Hoary bats, you might know them from their hoarfrost-like tips on their fur. That's where they get the name. This is the largest species that we have here in Pennsylvania. Anywhere from usually 20 to 30 grams, which if you, again, want some perspective, maybe you don't have $30 bills laying around. Me neither. Who carries cash anymore? But equally, if you have a CD, like a DVD, which I don't know how many of you have those either, but a CD usually weighs about 15 grams. And so if you have 2 CDs or DVDs together, that is the weight of your average hoary bat. And then finally, we have the eastern red bat, a bit of a misnomer, again, with these creative names. Usually they're kind of orange, but it seems like most orange animals get called red, aside. But the eastern red bat, again, is a very common bat. A similar trend from these last 3 bats that we named here, the silver-haired, the hoary, and the eastern red, is that they are all migratory tree bats. And so you will not see them hibernating below ground. Maybe a silver-hair if you're lucky. Sometimes they get a little confused and don't migrate. But mainly those 3 species will migrate south for the winter instead of hibernating in the state. All of those other species that we named will be hibernating underground come a few months here. The eastern reds and the hoaries are currently making their way south to get to some warmer climate. They're kind of the snowbird bats. And again, you won't ever find them, or rarely you will find them inside of homes or bat boxes, mainly because they are tree roosting, tree obligate species. So their peelage helps them blend in with dead leaves or brownish leaves like your eastern red bat there or your hoary. And so they'll actually hang and roost in leaf clusters in trees for the summer. Just to give you a size comparison here, we have Pennsylvania's, what I call Pennsylvania's smallest. Again, they kind of argue with tricolors. The eastern small-footed versus a hoary bat. One night we were lucky to catch both of them when we were mist netting. And so this is just a size comparison here. We can see that eastern small-footed, four-ish grams on the left-hand side, hoary bat on the right. Even the size of the heads, you can kind of see the difference in, and then the body also here on that right-hand picture just kind of gives you a size comparison, right, for how different the bats in Pennsylvania can be. Moving on here, now that we know about the bats of Pennsylvania, let's talk about their environmental roles. And so the ecological role of bats in Pennsylvania is mainly insect control. This is pretty impressive for such a small animal. Like I said, some of these bats are only 4 or 5 grams, but they can consume their body weight, up to 25% of their body weight per night, per bat, just eating bugs. When they start getting pregnant, they're eating even more than that, just to prepare for the nursing period, right? So when we talk about a bat that only weighs 4 grams, you might say, well, 25% is only 1 gram. Imagine 1 gram of mosquitoes, $1 bill worth of mosquitoes, mass or weight wise, and that is a lot of bugs taken out of your yard, right? So smaller species are estimated to eat 1 million insects per bat per year. Which again, a lot of insects out of your yard. And they can consume pest insects such as mosquitoes, moths, arthropods, possibly even the spotted lanternfly. There was some work done out of, the name of the college is escaping me right now. I'm so sorry. But the college over there west of Harrisburg, again, sorry, forgot my college names, but they did some work. They looked at some guano samples, some fecal samples from big brown bats, and they were able to identify spotted lanternfly DNA. Shippensburg University, I remembered it. It's Shippensburg University is where this happened. But essentially, they identified spotted lanternfly DNA in the guano of big brown bats. What we don't know yet is whether or not these bats are just simply finding a new bug on the landscape and trying to eat it, or if it will become a stable or staple part of their diet. Just because we need to mention this, bats can act as pollinators and seed dispersers in other parts of the world. There are 500 species of plants around the world that rely on bats to pollinate their flowers. These are nighttime blooming flowers, so the flowers only open after the sun goes down. Things like mango, agave plants, where we get our tequila from, bananas, durians, you have it. Bats will pollinate those. Here we can see on the right is a picture of a bat getting a face full of nectar and pollen. Fruit bats also act as seed dispersers. So these tropical bats eat the fruit and then excrete the seeds far away from the parent tree, very similar to how birds will help disperse seeds or other animals. This all culminates into some economical benefits for bats. And so one is that it reduces the need for harmful pesticides and helps regulate insect populations. And it ends up saving millions of dollars in agriculture. And so I don't know about you, but I am a little wary of obsessive pesticide use, especially with increases in bug populations and the decrease in the bat populations. Pesticides seem to have been a little more normalized, and bats, a healthy bat population eating all of those pest insects do reduce the need for these pesticides, and hopefully get rid of the more pest-related aphid type insects that plague our farmers' crops, right? There is a study back in 2012. I believe it estimated that bats save the agriculture industry $22.9 billion with a B, $22 billion per year across the world. So not just America, but across the world, bats are potentially saving that much money for the agriculture industry. I am no economy major. We're a finance person, but more savings at the farm means more savings at the grocery store, essentially, right? But bats, although they do a lot for us, they have been plagued for some time with a disease called white nose syndrome, which some of you may have heard before, but we'll kind of gloss over it here. white nose syndrome is an overwintering disease that affects bats during hibernation. We can see here this little brown bat with a visible white nose syndrome infection. Kind of a misnomer. It does grow on the face and the muzzle of bats, but it can appear anywhere on the wings or the skin, like we see at the back, kind of near the elbow of this little brown bat. We see some white fuzz that is part of that fungus, that white nose syndrome affecting the bats. What it does mainly is white nose syndrome infection causes increased arousal rates, dehydration, and wing lesions to form on the wings of the bats. And what this does is it essentially causes bats to run out of energy during hibernation. And so when they're in hibernation, they're torpid. It's kind of like being in a coma, but not exactly. But essentially, when they're in torpor, they wake up occasionally to stretch their muscles, to reopen, kind of get their body, their immune system working again, their organs kind of refreshed. They wake up out of torpor occasionally. And when they go into hibernation, they go in with just enough energy, i.e. just enough body fat, to make it through the wintertime. And so what happens is when they are infected with white nose syndrome, they're waking up way too often, and now their allocation of arousals has been far exceeded, and they do not have the energy to withstand that many arousals, and they end up dying essentially from exhaustion, right? This disease has really hit Pennsylvania's bats hard, up to 95% mortality in some species across the state. And so we can see here, this is kind of an outdated map, but you can kind of see the spread. So we go from cool colors being the oldest to warmer colors being the newest, goes up to 2022. But essentially the white nose syndrome fungus, PD, we'll get into that, showed up in Pennsylvania in about 2008, 2007, in a couple bigger mines that we have here in the state. And from there it spread. It showed up in New York. In a certain cave there. We think that because it's a fungus, it was probably brought over from Europe by some cavers, failure to clean gear, fungal spores. They go into a cave in New York and boom, now we have that fungus in the US. From there, it's probably transmitted by bats. They can fly, they, great distances, they might move around quite a bit. And they don't really have a concept of social distancing. And so it's very easy to spread these fungal spores around bat to bat. But that original jump was most likely a human brought error there. And as we can see, as the years go on, it slowly makes its way west all the way over. There was a big jump in 2015-16 over to Washington, and then it kind of made its way back across the US there. But to better understand white nose syndrome, we kind of have to understand something called the disease triangle, which affects or is applicable to most diseases that we talk about for anything, for animals, for humans. And what we need to understand is that for a disease to occur in parts of the triangle here, a pathogen must exist to cause the disease, right? We must have a host that is susceptible to said pathogen. In this case, it is the bats. And then we have to have an environment that promotes pathogen spread. And so we'll talk about these three things here quickly. So essentially keep that triangle in your mind here, that disease triangle. We'll start with the pathogen. So the white nose syndrome pathogen is called Pseudogymnoascus destructans. I'm going to call it PD from now on, so I don't have to keep saying that. But like I said, it is a non-native fungus, native over in Europe, but it was brought over here. Spread long distances by humans. Once it was here, spread by bat-to-bat contact. We can see this cluster of hibernating big browns over here. You could easily see the way that they hibernate, how easily fungal disease could spread through bats. That fungus invades the skin and the wing membranes during hibernation. And then the bats become infected, right? And it is a psychrophilic fungus, which means it is cold loving. So this fungus only grows or it thrives in a certain temperature range that happens to be where bats like to hibernate underground. And so bats, we talk about the host part of that triangle. Bats use torpor during hibernation to conserve energy. And so, like I said, it's kind of similar to being in a coma. but not quite. But there are some very similar negative effects, which include a lowered immune response, degradation of physiological processes. It leaves them open to predators, things like that. And so essentially these bats are down regulating all of their body systems in order to maximize their energy savings. And because of that, again, there are some negatives. That lowered immune response is a really big one. So when we talk about microclimates and the ability for bats to kind of tweak how long they stay torpid, because like I said, they don't stay torpid the entire way through winter. They do wake up occasionally to warm their bodies back up, get their immune system kind of revamped, maybe avoid some of those negative effects. And they do this by using microclimates to alter their expression of torpor. Mainly what I want you to see here is this in this red box at the bottom. We can see here that essentially, I'm going to explain this the easiest way I can here for time. But fat bats in that orange section, which would be a warmer section, and then we have skinnier bats in that blue section, which would be a colder section. And so essentially what this graph is showing you is that if bats have a lot of energy or body mass to make it through the winter, they will choose a warmer area to hibernate because it will enable them to not stay torpid as long, so they can be awake for more of the winter to avoid those negative effects. Whereas a bat that might be a little skinnier, might weigh a little less, might be a smaller bodied bat like those little browns, they would tend to choose a colder area to hibernate because they're essentially maximizing their expression of torpor and being able to save the most energy, right? So then we talk about the environment, which is the third part of that triangle. And different habitat temperatures affect fungal growth. So like I said, this PD, this fungus that causes white nose syndrome, is psychrophilic, so it's cold loving. PD growth rate peaks around 12 degrees Celsius, which for Fahrenheit users is anywhere, I think it's 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, right around that 50-degree mark. And what's dangerous is that's exactly where historically these bats like to hibernate. That's the temperature that they like to hibernate in. And so when we get a little warmer, that fungus can't survive. When we get a little colder, fungus kind of has a hard time growing, right? But you see that kind of peaks off and dies, that growth rate here on the right, right at about 17, 18 degrees Celsius. One really dangerous thing about PD is that it does not need bats to survive. So in a hibernacula, it can remain positive. Once the fungus is introduced, even if all the bats die, that fungus is still there. It's a generalist fungus. It will feed off of any organic matter. And so even if bats happen to come back, that site is still positive, which is bad news for the bats. And so what we have here is essentially a perfect storm for infection. And so just to kind of sum this up, bats will hibernate in the same environment where PD grows, that fungus there. PD then infects bats while their immune systems are suppressed because they're in torpor, and it causes increased arousal rates. And the bats then do not have the energy stored to deal with the increased arousals and end up perishing, right? And this may all seem doom and gloom, but there are some potential adaptations to white nose syndrome. One, plain and easy, if we don't have enough energy to make it through the winter, the bats might pack on more energy. Essentially, the bats enter hibernation with greater fat stores to enable them to combat those increased arousal rates from infection. The other option that bats have is to shift to colder areas in a hibernaculum, so anywhere where they hibernate, a mine, tunnel, railroad tunnel, cave, what have you. And so what we have seen here in Pennsylvania, at least, is that bats are shifting to colder areas within those hibernacula. And so, like I said in that previous slide, bats that are in colder areas will stay torpid for longer. They can save more energy. If a bat were to be infected, at least they can kind of maximize their energy savings and kind of stave off those increased arousals, which is exactly what we just talked about here. Other threats to bats may include things like wind energy, drought and climate change, and loss of habitat. There was a study here in 2024, the state of bats in North America, They are predicting that 53% of all North American bat species are estimated to have a high risk of extinction or elimination within the next 15 years. And so with that, we really need a call to action here. Bat conservation is incredibly important, and these guys are at a pretty high risk of danger and extinction. With that, we'll kind of talk about some positives here. How the PGC studies bats, and so we're trying to do our part every day. This is a 24/7 animal that we tend to study. So throughout the year, we at the PGC are studying bats, either by way of summer mist netting, which we can see here. There's a big brown bat caught in a mist net. It's a very fine nylon net. We will go into the woods. These nets are about 50 feet wide, 18 meters, and about 30 feet tall, and we'll put them in the woods at night in big long flight corridors. The idea is that the bats cannot see or echolocate through this mesh, this netting, and they'll fly into it and get caught, where we can then untangle them and do our workups that are necessary, whether that's attaching GPS or telemetry transmitters to them so we can then track them throughout the next day or the next week. We can track them and figure out where they're roosting. We'll put bands on them, which I think I talk about here in just a second. So then we'll talk about spring and fall harp trapping. And so this is what we're currently doing right now during our nights as biologists. We essentially go to these areas, these hibernacula, where the bats are swarming because they're flying in and out of this mine, or in this case, it's a railroad tunnel or a cave, back and forth all night, whether or not they're trying to kind of tease out if they're going to stay in there until the springtime or if it's going to be warm enough that they can come back out and feed, right? So what we'll do is we take this thing, it's called a harp trap. What it is it's a square aluminum frame with fishing wire vertically strung all the way across. And then there's a second layer to that with more fishing wire. And it ends up looking like a harp. Idea is if we put this frame in front of a opening and then plastic over the opening and kind of funnel them in, they'll try to make it through that trap and fall into this bag down here. Again, if you can see my mouse, it's a little kind of greenish bag at the bottom of the trap, and we can go in there and then scoop out the bats. We also do acoustics, so bats echolocation and most bat vocalizations are not audible to us, but we do have specialized high frequency microphones that we can deploy in an area and determine what species might be flying around that area, which is really cool because as a biologist, although it is really fun to capture bats, it does get difficult traveling all over the place and working nights constantly to figure out what's in an area. And so we can deploy these acoustic detectors, and there's only one of me, but if I have 10 detectors, I can cover 10 different spots over a many week-long period, and we can stick that into some software and determine what bats are in the area. So it's more of a passive way to survey for bats. The winter time coming up here, usually January through February, we start doing hibernacula surveys. So this is me climbing a wall of a cave, searching for bats in all of the little cracks. If you're claustrophobic, not the best job, but it is pretty fun to do. I have some great stories. We can get into those later. But essentially, what's really cool about hibernacula surveys is if we have a site, a specific cave, right, we know that every bat in the state during January or February is hibernating. So unlike the summertime where we might have one net set up in the woods, we're missing a ton of bats. But we know that during the wintertime, they're all hibernating underground somewhere. And so it gives us a really good idea of how the population changes from year to year if we keep going into this same mine or cave, and maybe one year we had 200 bats and the next year maybe we had 250, right? And so that's the most holistic way to track bat populations for us here in Pennsylvania, is by doing these surveys. We have a big list of sites all over the state that we will kind of survey on rotation year after year. And then finally, we have bat banding. So I kind of mentioned it when we talked about summer netting there, but essentially what we do is we capture the bats, and similar to a bird band or a bird cuff, it's just a cuff style. It goes on the arm. It is numbered. It's numbered from Fish and Wildlife Service. And we know that if we stick this on a bat and we can catch it maybe 2 years from now in a different spot, we know that this bat is at least 2 years old, or we know that, we caught this bat before, maybe in a different location, right? Just a way to help us keep track of bats. We only ban certain species. There is a little bit of worry with how tight these guys will wedge themselves into cracks or crevices. Something like a northern long-eared or an eastern small-footed might wedge itself into some cracks, and we don't want that band to be the reason that they get stuck and can't get out, right? So with that, here's a short little video. I'll let it play twice here of what it looks like when we walk up to one of those harp traps in the spring or the fall time for emergence or the swarm period, right? And so you can see those are mostly little browns crawling around in the bag there. And as biologists, we scoop them up and start to work on them. One last thing here we will do is called UV photography. So white nose syndrome, it's an infection again, but the byproduct of that fungus reproducing in the wing membrane is detectable via UV light. And so what it looks like is essentially orange spots on the wings. And so right at the tail end of the winter time, we can go in, grab the bats off the wall so we're not disturbing them too much. It's getting warmer out, so hopefully they'll be okay. And we can stick them on a UV light box and take a picture with a special camera. And you can see that if they are infected, you'll see these little orange dots on the wings. And that spot right there is how to tell if a bat is infected with white nose syndrome, right? What's really cool is we can then put it into a computer program and it will measure the proportion of orange glow or kind of orange fuzz on the wing to the area without infection, and it kind of spits us out a sequence of infection or proportion of infection there. And so what we can learn here, this is a much better picture from those oranges, is we've learned some lessons from remnant populations. So field studies inspired by earlier works found that infections are less severe today. And so here is a wing of a hibernating little brown bat that we took in 2011. You can see big orange spots there. Most of the wing is covered, whereas we compare it to a little brown from 2018. This is caught in Ohio, but pretty close distance-wise, maybe only 100 miles apart. We can see that infection is severely less. And part of that is because of that natural adaptation to seek out colder areas that's outside of that fungal growth range. Might be a result of the bats just leaving super warm areas, right, where that fungus is growing the most, or those higher fat stores, right? So it's probably a behavioral thing at this point. I've had some people ask me before if there's a genetic resistance forming. Evolution does not work that quickly, but maybe as time goes on, these bats, similar to the ones in Europe, will start to become more resistant to that infection. So this brings us to a brighter future for Pennsylvania's bats. So one big thing we do here at the Game Commission, aside from capture these bats, is we try to help them as much as we can to avoid infection and try to create areas for them that are kind of havens from this fungus. And so one thing we do is hibernacula manipulation, and this is physically manipulating a hibernacula, and it can yield higher survivability of bats. And so what you can see here is an old railroad tunnel. It's abandoned. In the wintertime, because it was completely open, sorry about the machines, I don't have an original picture, but it's essentially a completely open railroad tunnel. In the wintertime, the wind would whip through there. It was really variable, either really cold or really warm, right? There wasn't a lot of stability, a lot of airflow, and a lot of openness for the bats that want to be in there, lots of light as well. And what we can do is we take dirt, pile it all the way up to just below the keystone of that tunnel. And this is what it looks like when we put a bat gate over it. And so essentially what we've done here is we've kind of boarded up the entrance to that railroad tunnel. And what it does is it kind of has a cooling effect, right? So cold air will sink and hot air rises. And so what it does is it cools down the hibernacula a few degrees, but more importantly is it really creates a cold air sink. So the temperature in there not only is colder for the bats that want to extend their torpor bout length and decrease their arousal rate, but it's more stable too. And so the bats aren't constantly having to wake up and move back and forth to maybe find a warmer or colder spot, whatever fits their preference. The whole thing is a lot more stable. The bat gates are purely to keep larger animals or people out and keep the bats safe, right? Another thing we do here at the Game Commission is PEG 8000 treatments. This is kind of a newer thing. This is a picture of me mid spraying. So PEG stands for polyethylene glycol. The 8000, I'll know that sounds scary. It's just kind of a molecular weight that they use in the lab. This is a kind of food safe or kind of food grade thickener. They use it in things like Jello, I think, has a little bit of polyethylene glycol in it, although you can't eat it. Antifreeze also has polyethylene glycol in it. And what we do is we mix it with water. It kind of forms this kind of sappy, kind of goo, kind of jelly substance. And we spray it on the walls of a hibernaculum during the summertime when the bats aren't in there. What it does is it coats that fungus that is living on the walls. And it creates a drought condition. So it coats it and then cuts it off from the outside air. And what it does is when the fungus goes into a drought condition, it's cut off from the outside air. It thinks, oh, there's no more water. I need to slow down my reproduction until water comes back. And so by creating this drought condition, we then slow the growth and reproduction of this fungus. Treated sites that we've done this in have shown pretty good declines in infected bats. So when we talk about going in with that UV photography, we see a lot less orange the years after treating these sites, right? And so we're showing that we can reduce the fungal load in these underground sites and make it safer for bats to hibernate in. So with that, now that we talked about what the Game Commission does to help bats, we can talk about what you guys can do to help bats maybe in your neighborhood, North Coventry Township. Contact the PGC if you have a nuisance bat problem and seek help from a reputable pest control company. Depending on the species, we would need to take certain steps to ensure that the bats are safely excluded, especially when we start talking about how many bats here are federally listed. The common bats, like I said, you will see in a home are usually big browns and little browns. You might find reds or tricolors around the home, but usually not inside of a structure, right? One big thing you can do is avoid disturbing hibernating bats. We just talked for, almost 50 minutes here about the importance of arousal rates and saving energy for the bats. And so if you know of an area where bats are hibernating, please try your best not to disturb them. And then we can put up bat boxes to offer up alternative roost sites. We'll get to that in just a slide here. But we'll talk about neighborhood bats. Maybe if you're walking around in the evenings in the summer, you might be able to see some of these guys. So when we talk about bats in your neighborhood, southeastern Pennsylvania, our most common species that you'll see flying around are going to be big brown bats, red bats, and hoary bats. You will also see tricolor and silver-haired bats. It is possible, although they're a little more rare, they're a little more shy and kind of stick to more wooded areas. The reason you see these big three larger bodied bats is because they are open air flyers. They tend to, again, have a lower frequency echolocation. They tend to forage in wider open areas like backyards, town parks that are very open. If you'd like to see a little brown or, a northern long-eared, you'd have to be pretty deep in the woods. And by then, all the leaves and things really obscure your vision. The best way to see a bat is to use the sky as a backdrop, like we can see here with this eastern red bat on the right. That allows you to easily see their silhouettes. Usually our reds and big browns will fly first during the evening, usually about 20 minutes before sunset, official sunset, like on your weather app on your phone. And they're pretty easily observed at dusk. So I'm sure all of you have probably seen a bat. You might not have known it. But the easiest way to tell bats from birds is that bats never really glide. They are always flapping their wings. If it's still kind of daylight out, you might even be able to see the color here, like on this red bat, right? We can see those orange kind of forearms and that orange reddish fur, right? But most of the time you'll just see a silhouette and you know that it's a bat of some sort flying around, right? Here's another little video. We'll play it real quick. This is kind of what you'd be looking at when we talk about bats and silhouetting against the sky, right? So you can see that these bats are flying. These are little browns flying in a box. We can see that once they dip kind of into that corn or that foliage, you can't really see them because it just gets too dark. But if you have the sky as your backlight, it's pretty easy to see them flapping around. And again, they'll make these kind of non-linear kind of flight patterns like you see here, kind of undulations, and they're constantly flapping. You never really see them gliding around. Very cool. One other thing you guys can do to get involved in the kind of bat science is something called the ABC, which is Appalachian Bat Count. This is on our Game Commission website. If you Google Appalachian Bat Count, or you can shoot me an email and I can give you the link. But essentially, we have bat colonies across the state, whether those are people who have a colony of big browns in their barn that they don't mind living with, or maybe bat boxes on the side of a garage like you see here on the right. And what we do is 2 times a summer, we try to count all of these bat colonies, right? And so each bat colony is counted twice per summer, one time before the pups become volant, which is flighted, before the pups can fly, and then after the pups can fly. So each site gets 2 counts. The idea here is that we can use the difference of those 2 counts to estimate reproductive success of a maternity roost or maternity colony, right? Data submitted by the public adds more info and more sites than I can get to by myself. And so the summer is only so long. You only have about a month for each of these counts, a month-long window, and there are only so many evenings, throughout the month. And so this is something that if you want to get involved with the Game Commission, if you know of an area, if maybe your house or you have a friend that has a barn, really cool to be able to sit out there, 2 nights, catch up with your friends and count some bats as they emerge for the evening. You then report that to us in a little spreadsheet, and we enter it in. And this data goes a long way to help us kind of track the health of our bat populations across the state. We're going to finish up here with some bat box considerations. So essentially, when you want to put up a bat box, there are a few general rules that would kind of ensure you the best success of usage, right? I've seen some pretty bad bat boxes in my time, and people ask me, Levi, why aren't there any bats in my box? And maybe we'll learn why, and you can share it with others, right? So essentially, the recent boom of bat box types has inspired further research. So you can buy boxes on Amazon now. I think I've seen them at certain hardware stores before, and which is all great that we can buy them from Amazon and online, and they're so reachable. But certain styles and colors of boxes aren't the best for bats. This research was kind of based in the southern part of the country where it gets really hot. And they said that all black boxes without vents are susceptible to really high temperatures in the summer and are prone to overheating, which can be a turnoff for bats. I'm here to tell you that in Pennsylvania, we really don't have those high extreme temperatures that the South sees, or if we do, it's only for a day or 2, right? The bats are able to live through that. And when we talk about box placement, the warmer is usually the better, which is why we see bats in attics or the tops of barns where it is stiflingly hot for humans. But when we say hot, it is different than what a bat considers too hot, right? There is a couple papers out there that say that female little browns, while they're lactating, while they're nursing, need to have body temperatures upwards of 110 degrees Fahrenheit to even start producing milk, right? So again, hot for us, different from hot for bats, right? And so all black boxes, dark colored boxes seem to do really well in Pennsylvania. One thing I do encourage is find a box with some sort of venting on it, even if it's just a small cutout along the midline of the box. Helps a lot to get some airflow into the box. Maybe the bats need a 1 or 2 degrees temperature change. They can climb down or up to see. The way we do it here at the Game Commission is that we use boxes that are bi-colored. They're 2 different colors. You can see here is a pile of them laying, getting painted for the summertime. So what we do is we have these big boxes. They are black on the top. We paint them white on the bottom, and then you see those row of vent holes around the midline there. What this enables the bats to do is, if it is the early morning and it's still a little chilly outside, they can climb up to that black section, which is going to be absorbing a lot of light. Maybe a higher temperature, the air kind of gets trapped up there, right? And they can warm up. Come the mid-afternoon, when we start getting, highs of 80, 85, 90, they can climb a foot or two down into that white section where the vents are, and hopefully get a little bit cooler air. Again, they're by the entrance there as well. So the more you can give to bats to give them a wider range of temperature is going to be the better, whether that is a 2-box setup, whether that is just a kind of a larger box, or again, this is why you see bats in barns, because barns are so big, or attics, that they have that space for bats to kind of moderate their body temperatures by moving from one side of the barn to the other, one side of the attic to the other. So that is essentially what we're trying to mimic with bat boxes, right? Except on a much smaller scale. Finishing up here, we're going to talk about bat box placement. So when we want to place a bat box, we need to place it somewhere where the bats can find it, right? And so if you walk outside at night and you see bats flying around, probably a good idea to try to put a box up where you see them flying around, as opposed to where you're not observing them. Usually this is near tree lines, shrub lines, or any other kind of feeding area. Maybe if you have a little pond on your property, good spot to put one is near the pond. In fact, we kind of encourage people to put boxes about a quarter mile from a water source, and then leave adequate room in front of the box for a flight path. And so idea here is that bats have trouble taking off of the ground, so they need to drop a little bit to gain some lift. And so when you install your box, make sure it's 10 feet or so from any branches or larger trees that could potentially either shade the box or grow into the opening and kind of block the bats from getting in and out, right? We want the boxes to be at least 4 meters above the ground. This is mainly to avoid predation. A lot of people ask me about predator guards, like you see on smaller bird houses, or maybe your purple martin houses have a big predator cone on the pole. We don't use them here at our agency. I know agencies that use them. I think it's a dealer's choice operation. If you have a lot of predators, raccoons, snakes, whatever in your area, wouldn't hurt to install, right? And then finally, the direction matters, similar to bluebird boxes. We usually encourage people to face the boxes south or southeast for adequate sun exposure. Idea here is that you want the box, most websites will cite about 8 hours of direct sunlight. Morning sun is preferred over afternoon. And so if we face it southeast, sun rises in the east, kind of southeast of us, I guess. In the summertime, we're pretty north. Blast that box in the morning so the bats can warm up after a long night of flying. But by the afternoon, the box isn't in direct sunlight and the bats aren't baking inside, right? There are a couple natural alternatives to bat boxes, including snags, trees with loose bark, and then rock crevices along cliff lines and scree. And so with that, I'll say thank you. I can take any questions. I'll leave this up on the screen if you want our number, or on our website here, we have some cool bat printouts, educational materials, and things for those of you who might be teachers and the like. And that's it. That's what I got.
Okay, anybody who has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Levi your questions. I know I had a question about the bat boxes and where to put them. So you did answer that with your last part there. So that was great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a big thing about bat boxes, I don't often include this, but I see them a lot. The shading part really matters, right? The solar exposure is really important for these animals. And so I see a lot of times people will put bat boxes on trees in their yard, live trees. And then they're surprised that it doesn't get used. Sometimes squirrels move into them, right? And that's because the box is simply, it's too shaded, it's too cool because it's under all those leaves, right? And it doesn't get the proper exposure. Typically, the bats will avoid boxes like that. Then there's also something to be said about putting a box on your home. or garage, although it is very great because houses hold on to a lot of heat, and they're pretty stable temperatures. You do run the risk of, if the bats don't like the box for whatever reason, they might end up in your attic or in whatever structure it's attached to. So we tend to try to put them on poles as often as we can.
Hey, Levi,
Yes, sir.
the why the teeth in bats when they eat predominantly insects?
Yeah, so bats have evolved those big chompers mainly because they're flighted animals and they're trying to catch something that's also flying, right? And so those teeth function to allow them to hold on to their prey during flight because they might have to land or something to fully eat it. Sometimes it's too big, like if it's a big moth or something, they might land and then continue to eat instead of eating it in flight. And so they need those teeth to hold on to whatever they're biting. And when we think about bugs, they can range anywhere from, beetles or soft-bodied moths. So what's really cool is when we look at red bat teeth, red bats predominantly eat these softer bodied moths. And so their teeth stay really sharp because they're not wearing them down on the chitin of an insect because the moths are soft and squishy, right? Compared to big browns tend to eat more harder shelled beetles, maybe other, bigger insects flying around, stuff with more chitin in their shells. When we think about like June bugs or cicadas or something that might be a little harder, they need those teeth to break through that shell. And as a result, we see different species, their teeth actually wear down more. And so red bats, their teeth stay like needles their entire lives. They never seem to wear down. But big browns, we catch them, and it's not uncommon if you get one that's 2 or 3 years old that the edges of the teeth will be kind of ground down. Right.
Thank you very much, Levi. We really appreciate it. We've got some people who are saying what a great job it was. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.